1% each of phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, chlorine, sodium, magnesium, iron, lead, copper, boron, and a dozen or so other trace elements. This is the human newborn baby. Carl stirred it all up, smiled in that way that he smiled, and then asked, why was nothing alive in there? What was missing? Why were there no cries of life emanating from the box? The same sorts of questions had been haunting me for years. What are we? Where did we come from? What makes us alive? How did the cosmos begin? What's it all for? My childhood answers to Carl's questions about animating the stuff of life went back and forth between soul and electrical chemical energy. These seemed to me the two possible poles, divine and secular, and I flitted back and forth from one to the other with youthful life force and indecisiveness. The image has stayed with me all these years. What was missing in that box? Order, of course. One cannot dump the parts of an airplane on a runway and then wonder why nothing takes off. But it seems to me today that there might be something more deeply problematic with the question itself. The chemicals that Carl stirred in his box were of just the right proportion to make a single human. And one way or another, I fear we are still searching for how that one single, solitary, unitary, autonomous individual came to life. The first cell, the first strand of DNA, the first self-replicating peptide. And this is all very liberal in the classic sense of that term. To paraphrase Aristotle, life is said in many ways. Most attempts to define life run aground on familiar shores. Common to most of them, however, is a sense of self-made identity. Against Aristotle, there's little teleology these days in our understanding of life, unless that teleology is itself self-constituted. This is perhaps a mistake, for what's lost when teleology is lost? Perhaps the universe did not mean to create life. It certainly did not mean to create humans. But in tossing out all talk of meaning in our discourse, we overlook the possibility that the definition of life might best be had by looking at what it does, rather than what it is. Even the most hardy and strapping definitions of life are ultimately too bootstrappy and too without heart. It's a consequence of historical accident, not scientific necessity. To take some standard definitions, we might say that a thing is alive if it's autonomous, if it metabolizes, if it reproduces itself. Immanuel Kant saw the difference between a machine and an organism to be that in a machine, the parts exist for each other, but not by each other. Their operation has nothing to do with building the machine. The parts of an organism work together, but also produce the organism. Each part is cause and effect. And in this sense, an organism is, for Kant, and in modern parlance, a self-organizing entity. More contemporary definitions give their own twist to this basic template. Lynn Margulis sees life as that which is autopoietic, from the Greek for self, auto, and making, poien. Autopoietic life continually produces itself, engaging in self-maintenance. Stuart Kauffman defines life as a self-reproducing autocatalytic system capable of performing at least one thermodynamic energy work cycle. Now, it's not that I wish to argue against any of these definitions, but rather to point out some of the underlying assumptions that may have us looking, in the end, in only one direction. Life is taken to be something quite special in most definitions, something that's made from non-living parts, yet itself is somehow self-made. The words auto, self-making, self-reproducing, these are the key terms, I think. They are all reflexive. Life becomes life by doing something to itself. Autonomy is neither an ancient nor a natural term. Seeing things as separate, self-sufficient, self-directed, these have a political and metaphysical history. In the 17th century, this radical individualism took a secure hold in our culture in the form of liberalism. Descartes' isolated monadic self would be the start of all modern Western metaphysics and epistemology. Thomas Hobbes isolated selfish, equal creatures warring in a state of nature, would found all social contract theory, which is to say most political theory in the West. Galileo and Newton's mathematization of the natural world and conception of objectivity as the opposite of subjectivity would set the standard for scientific inquiry. The other subsequently becomes a nuisance in the search for truth. The other is at best an afterthought. Philosophy consequently undertakes a centuries-long project of proving the existence of other minds. Democracies spring up in which I am most free when I'm most left alone. Community, being inherently with others, is vilified. And thus, when we go to define life, we naturally start by seeing whatever is alive as radically individual, a unit, an autonomous thing. And we see the spark that brought it into being as necessarily self-given. For what else is there apart from the self? Life, for the liberal, is an individual enterprise. We go looking for that one thing that was first alive, the Ur-Eve to us all, or to mix mythological metaphors, that first Venus rising from the foam within the cell of her half-shell, alone in some warm and frothy little pond. Communitarianism stands as an alternative. Communitarianism maintains there is no self without the other, that we are first and foremost in community, defined, indeed constituted, by our enmeshment with each other. There is always a co-constitution to identity. Phenomenologically speaking, I am the point of overlap of all my roles and relationships. I am not prior to the other, nor definable without her. And if this is the case, we have at our disposal a way in which to critique the liberal worldview that sees the origin of life as a self-reflexive spark of energy. Could the first living thing have been one thing and still be alive? What would it mean to be one living thing? Robinson Crusoe makes sense to us as a story because we in community read it. We in community imagine someone stranded from community, someone thus dangerously close to losing his humanity, his identity. But what would it mean to be the first living thing? Without a biosphere? Without an ecological environment? Without an other? When we imagine that first living thing, is our liberalism shaping our experiments and our models? Are we looking for a Hobbesian peptide in a state of nature? A Cartesian RNA self in radical isolation in a little pond, a Leibnizian mound of monads in the bubbles atop a 4 billion-year-old percolating ocean? Is the myth of the capitalist self-made man rewritten as the myth of the first self-made molecule, pulling itself up by its own bootstraps to make it in the big time like a mitochondrial Bill Gates? Perhaps so many scientists vilify Aristotle today more for the friends that he keeps than for the man himself. When Aristotle was rediscovered in the West, St. Aquinas took him up and applied him to Christian thought. Teleology thus took on a whole new meaning, with God at the end of the chain. But teleology need not imply a divine maker. It's little known that Darwin himself admired Aristotle. Teleology may indeed play a major role in understanding life, but for now, in passing, let us simply note that Aristotle's notion of teleology is quite complex, allowing, for instance, for the possibility that organisms often arise spontaneously out of inanimate matter. Many insects and some fish and several plants are said to do this by Aristotle. In Aristotle's The Generation of Animals, we learn that such things arise by chance, and thus lack teleological causation. They are for the sake of something, but not for the sake of what actually results. In his book Physics, chapters 3 through 5, Aristotle considers the role of chance in causality. Here, he argues that the lack of teleological causation is what makes chance seem to appear to the common man as outside of reason, logos. The problem is that if the cause of some action is not, for instance, what an agent intended,